They were left to wonder, can I trust this organization? They were left to wonder, can I trust my leaders? Can I trust the people around me? Am I going to get a fair shake if I've made a mistake? Is this an organization I want to be a part of? For a month, they were left to wonder on their own. They were left to talk to only one another because nobody else understood. And they were left to make up stories about what it meant for them to be in our organizations because we did nothing. We do all these things to build trust, and then we destroy it with inaction. Usually, when we get hard feedback, it's actually our skills and gifts in excess. That it's not that we have these character flaws that we need to really get rid of. It's that we have these gifts and skills that when we're not under stress, they show up perfectly. But when we are under stress, we think if a little is good, more is better. People are demanding that their leaders know how to connect with them differently, that their leaders know how to lean into a space that is rife with emotion, uncertainty, and as leaders, we just haven't really been taught those skills. And leaders of today are needing to learn a different skill set.
And what defines a great leader?
Really, a great leader is one who can read the environment, one who knows the people they're leading, and really has the emotional skill set to navigate those two things, that uncertain environment and the fact that people are people. We're human beings coming to work every day.
And what are some of the critical skills that today's leaders really, really need?
One critical skill that leaders need to have is the ability to really just listen and get curious. But the truth is we can't have all the answers. So if we can get really good at slowing down, at listening and getting curious with our teams, like that will help you as a leader more than anything else. I think society is demanding different things, right? Society is coming up and we're seeing this across the board and we're saying, like, that's not how we want to engage in our work cultures anymore. We're seeing more discussions around mental health. We're seeing more discussions around inequities. Learning a new skill set about how you have these really hard conversations, it can be a lot of work. And it can be practicing something you are uncomfortable in and haven't had a lot of practice in doing so.
What does a more transparent and less hierarchical style of leadership look like, and how do we even get there?
The hierarchical leadership opportunities, like, they're going away. That's not who people want as leaders anymore. They want to be involved, they want to contribute. And to really do that as a leader, when you can't just say, here's the list of the things you need to do, now go do it, and not really engage people in that process, that's not what people want. And so we have to really, as leaders, step into that space and get more curious. And like you said, be more transparent, and that can be hard. I think I shared a story with you about just prior to going to Iraq. And I was going to be taking command for the very first time. This was my second tour to Iraq. So I wasn't necessarily nervous about going to Iraq, but I had some apprehension about going into command. What I didn't know, I didn't grow up in the world of the squadron I was going to be commanding. And so I had reached out to a female leader I very much respected and admired. She's amazing. And I said, listen, I'm getting ready to go take command. What do I need to know as a woman? And she said, nothing. Leadership is leadership. And I thought, oh, okay, great. So I went over to Iraq and I was in command, and I was constantly butting up against things that just didn't feel right. Like I felt like something was off. Like I had one captain at one point, we were having struggles with our dining facility. And I said, like, hey, we really got to get this in check. Backstory, it was all about Cocoa Puffs. I had a commander who was anti-Cocoa Puffs, but we don't have time to go into that today. And he said, all over it, ma'am. I got this. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't think much of it. And then a couple weeks later, the Cocoa Puffs were still there. And I asked him again, like, hey, what's going on with the Cocoa Puffs? And he's like, ma'am, I told you we're all over it. We got this. And I said, well, I don't think you do, because Cocoa Puffs are still there. Little moments like that where it just felt like I was being dismissed, where it felt like I was getting these pats on the head, even though I was substantially senior to him in rank. And I thought, that's just feels off. I then had another moment where a leader senior to me was giving me feedback. And he said, listen, I think you're doing a great job, but sometimes I think you flirt to get your way. And I was like, flirt? Like, it just threw me into a tailspin because you know me. I mean, I don't ever try to use femininity to get my way or to make inroads. I did grow up in the Air Force as a communications officer, public affairs officer is what we call it in the military. I was the liaison to the community, to the media, sometimes to Congress, which means I had to be personable and I had to know how to engage people.
Very different from flirting.
Very different from flirting. And it threw me into such a tailspin because sometimes I share this story and I'll ask people, what does flirting look like to you? So if I were to ask you right now, like, what does flirting look like to you? How would you know if someone's flirting with you?
I think flirting, like when you're in a social place with someone and you're both trying to send signals to each other, like, hey, I kind of like you, and you look to get those signals back. And, you know, we're social animals, we're attuned to it, you know, some better than others, but it's the dance of mating.
Yeah, but what are the behaviors you're seeing?
What are the behaviors you're seeing? Well, but I think context also matters. Like if I make a joke in a social context, it could be a flirt. If I make a joke in a professional context, just, you know, like I make a little self-deprecating joke.
Yeah.
You know, extreme flirting would be, I guess, touching, you know, somebody rubbing a knee or touching a shoulder. That's a flirt, you know. Mm-hmm. I guess the proverbial batting your eyelids.
Which I can't do.
Which I can't do either.
But
I don't know. It's hard.
It is, right? You make my point.
It's a good question. It's hard.
You make my point in that most of us can't describe it. And when we do, we say things like, well, you were smiling, you might have giggled. I actually touched one of your staff members this morning when I came in and I said, how are you doing? I touched his shoulders, right? And so these behaviors
Stop flirting with my staff.
I know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And so all of these behaviors that sometimes people say are flirtatious behaviors are the very same behaviors that I had to cultivate as a public affairs officer. Smiling, being
Okay, so is there such thing as female leadership or not?
Yeah, so I was getting there. So I left there thinking, oh my gosh, there was so much about that experience that was different because I was a woman. And so, yes, do I think sometimes there are things about being a woman in a male-dominated environment that may just be behaviors that come naturally to us? Things like more communicative, right? We tend to collaborate. We tend to communicate more. We tend to be more inclusive in bringing people in. Not exclusive to women, but maybe more practiced by women. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, I think there are ways that men traditionally behave. There are ways that women traditionally behave. I don't think it's male leadership and female leadership. I think it is, there are some behaviors that maybe as a general rule, not in its entirety, that we might be more practiced at. I think there's a bigger discussion to have. Like you would ask me what it was like being a woman in the military or, you know, is there female leadership? When I get asked the question, what was the hardest part about being a woman in the military? The answer I've come to is the emotional labor. Because I had these skills and I could sit in that discomfort of other people's emotion, people started to come to me. And I would have people come to me from other squadrons who would say, hey, ma'am, could I get 10 minutes of your time? And I'd be like, of course, right? Because I want everyone to feel healthy and to get through, like to talk about the things that are frustrating them. And what I realized after like a year or so of doing this was that that's real time. So spending all that time when people would want to talk to me about where they were struggling, the time I spent doing that, because I believe in it and I think it matters, is time I wasn't getting to go out and talk to my units. It was time I wasn't getting to do the admin that all of us have to do, wasn't getting through emails. And so it was it was a quantifiable thing. And so the hardest part for me about being a woman in the military was not all of the environmental things that people think about being a woman in the military. It was to be the kind of leader I wanted to be. Is it because I'm a woman or not? I don't know. But my ability to sit in that emotional space was time that my male peers did not have to expend, right? Because their own people weren't going to them to talk because they didn't have the ability to sit in this space with them, which means they didn't have that half hour, or they had that half hour to do other things. They had that hour to do other things. That, for me, when I look back, is probably the hardest. That was the hardest thing. Same situation, same time in Iraq, there were 3 female commanders. 2 of the 3 of us were investigated for mistreatment of our airmen. A friend of mine was the investigating officer, and he said, I'm not seeing these women do anything I don't see men do every day. But when the women do it, it is perceived to be more toxic than when the men do it. The research shows that when men behave differently than society thinks we should be behaving, we are held to a different standard, and it's used against us more.
So what was the behavior? What was the thing that they were upset about that men do all the time?
I mean, swearing.
Swearing.
Swearing was the big one.
Swearing in the military.
She cussed at me. She dropped the F-bomb too many times.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That was the toxic behavior.
That was it. It was the behaviors of get it done, get your proverbial shit together. And when women behaved in a way that we all see men do every day. In fact, in most cases, men are rewarded for it. They're decisive.
So interesting.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. And I think you're right. It's these societal expectations. It's not the behavior per se. It's the expectation in the lane. If we think about what the lanes are in the 1800s and the but I'm serious. like if we go back through time, what the lanes for acceptable behavior for men and women have been, you know, those lanes move. Culture advances and norms and standards of behaviors change, and those lanes of expectations change. And that's very interesting that when somebody steps out of that lane of expectation, we find that jarring.
Yeah.
And in your case, worthy of investigation.
Yeah. It's so interesting because what used to be held against women, I think, is actually being held against men just as equally now.
Yeah.
You know, I was in Iraq, that was 2010, so that's 15 years ago. And the way I'm watching leadership change now, the feedback I get from employees who are working for leaders who maybe grew up in a very command and control environment, they are no longer tolerating that. Even in a traditionally command and control environment of the military, it's no longer being tolerated.
So now there's a new expectation, and too many, in this case men is what we're talking about, have been practicing in a different lane, and now they're trying to conform to the new lane.
100%. And they feel really lost because they've seen one kind of leadership modeled.
Yeah.
The expectations are changing rapidly.
Yeah.
They have not seen modeled the kind of leadership we actually need today.
Yeah. Okay, let's go deep.
Yeah, okay.
We've been playing up here.
Okay. Uh-oh.
When you were deployed, so 3 things happened to you simultaneously. Any one of those would have been difficult to manage by themselves. You were promoted. Mm-hmm. You were given your first command. Mm-hmm. And you were deployed for 365 days. Mm-hmm. So any one of those things is difficult to manage by itself, and all 3 of those happened simultaneously to you.
And command of a squadron I had no experience in.
And command of a squadron you knew nothing about, right? That wasn't your training.
Right.
Okay, so we'll add 4 things in there.
I could add a 5th, but we won't.
What was the 5th?
I was the only female in my leadership group.
Okay, so any one of those 5 things is difficult to manage, and you had all 5 things happen simultaneously. Yeah. And off you went for your deployment, and I saw you maybe a week after you got back, 2 weeks at the most. But it was all the emotions were raw, the experience was raw, and we went out for dinner, and I asked you a very simple question, which is, how was it?
It's so funny because even putting myself right back in that moment, hearing you say it, like I can feel all the raw emotions.
Tell me, as best you can remember, you took command of a squadron that was underperforming, and if I recall, the previous leaders had all been fired. Like the previous 2 or 3 leaders have been fired, and you were like, I'm going to turn it around. I'm going to be the one. I'm going to be the one who fixes this and makes. If I recall,
the career field as a whole was really having trouble with its commanders.
You were responsible for all the base operations at Balad Air Base.
Yeah, feeding, fitness, and fun.
Okay.
Right. So, and housing, and I mean, just everything that allowed people to exist on the base. The story I told you was that it just felt like everything was going wrong. I had a day where I went back to my trailer, and the inner story I was telling myself is, you are the absolute worst thing that has ever happened to leadership. You are a complete failure. Who thought that you could do this? Like, I had all of the shame narratives running on repeat and at max volume. And I had this moment where, you know, I first had my little mini like breakdown, but then I had this moment after talking to a couple friends about it that I thought, if I have failed, and maybe I have, like maybe I'm not meant to be a commander. Maybe this just isn't my calling. I'll go back to public affairs, which is all about, again, engagement, communication. I'll just go back to that, and I'll have a great career in the Air Force. So if I have failed, what impact do I really want to have? What do I want these people who I have been entrusted to care for, what do I want them to know? I want them to know they matter. I want them to know that what they're doing here is not in vain. I want them to know that the time away from their family, the time away from their lives, the danger they are accepting is worth something. And it matters because so often the airmen in my squadron, so often they were the ones who took the brunt of everyone else's stress. I would have a pilot throw milk at one of my airmen at the dining facility because we changed the policy on takeout, right? We couldn't take out containers anymore. I would have my airmen get yelled at because their laundry wasn't done in a timely fashion, even though it wasn't my airman doing the laundry, it was a contractor. And so they were just always taking the brunt of people's bad behavior. And so they were always getting beat up. And you could see that in their energy. Like often it just felt like we were beat dogs. And I thought, I want them to know, like, that's not true. That story they're telling themselves isn't true. I want them to know they matter. And I didn't know it then, but it started the journey of the next 15 years of my career. Because I realized I may never be the best at anything. There are always going to be moments I'm going to feel like I'm failing. And who I want to be as a leader at the core is to make people know they matter and what they're doing matters. I think the first thing that happened was I felt better. And when I felt better, I wasn't barking as much. I wasn't as stressed. I wasn't as tied to outcomes because I was more concerned about the people. And you could just see a tangible shift in the way they laughed with one another, the way they came to me with opportunities and new ideas. I could see the way my own officers took a breath. And I think just overall, the stress level of the entire organization dropped.
But what ended up actually happening at the performance level?
You can't help but have better performance when you have all that.